recording.
Okay, welcome to those of us that are here in person and to our colleagues on Zoom. I'm really delighted to be joined today by a number of very smart colleagues in person and in the internet to talk about creativity beyond crisis. My name is Caitlin.
Buenos días. Buenos días a las personas que nos están acompañando el día de hoy, tanto presencialmente como por el enlace de Zoom. Tenemos un panel de personajes muy distinguidos con nosotros el día de hoy.
So we're going to have interpretation. So at this point, we're going to activate it. And there are instructions on the slide. And if you could choose your preferred language, it would be great if you could do so now. And so you'll hear the presentations in that language for the rest of the
El día de hoy contamos con el servicio de interpretación, tanto para el inglés como el español. Y dentro de unos momentos vamos a activar el servicio. Por favor, es muy importante seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia, o el inglés o el español.
So that makes it available. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to say just a few brief words about the programming today before I move into the introduction of our speakers. So this conference is titled Creativity Beyond Crisis, and we're trying to think together about how the idea of creative cities, youth activism, and public art can be thought in ways that forward the goals of social justice rather than economic development. I want to thank my collaborators. So Kirsten Scott taught with me this summer in ways that were extremely helpful. Also, Dave Patel, and later on, Ray Chandler joined me in thinking through some of these questions as well. I also want to thank the Global Studies Center for their very, very generous funding and their very, very generous logistical support. Eric and the rest of the team have been amazing. I'd also like to thank Christine Choi, my research assistant, who helped out quite a bit with publicity, as well as the Center for Latin American Studies, who provided some funding and connected us to global wordsmiths who are kindly doing interpretation for us today. A couple words on logistics. So if you haven't already, make sure that you select the interpretation logo and pick the language of your choice. And also be aware we are recording the panel session, so you can also watch it later on. So today's panel is titled Creative Industries and Urban Development in Global Context, Tourism, Gentrification, Heritage Work, and Social Justice Advocacy in the Urban Art. It'll be moderated by myself and Dr. Ray Chandler, who is my colleague in the Department of Communication. Our speakers include Ricardo Klein from the University of Valencia, Amanda Boston from the University of Pittsburgh, Joaquin Ruiz Uldemolin from the University of Valencia, Gina Obando from DACA Mestiza in Cali, Colombia, and Ligia Ferro from the University of Porto. So I'm going to be sharing biographical information about each of our speakers right before they speak. So we'll have presentations from each presenter, then a couple moderated questions from Curry and myself, and then we're going to open it up to question and answers from the audience. So we're going to start with Dr. Klein, whose talk is titled Artivism as a Response to Tourism and Gentrification, an analysis from cultural practices and public spaces in Barcelona. Ricardo Klein from the University of Valencia is a sociologist, has a master's degree in social work from the University of the Republic of Uruguay, and a PhD in management of culture and heritage from the University of Barcelona. Professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at the University of Valencia, he teaches subjects related to the sociology of culture, cultural politics, qualitative methodology, and sociological theory. He's a member of the Center on Studies on Culture, Power, and Identities at the University of Valencia. And his research areas include cultural politics, cultural practices and public spaces, creative cities, and cultural management. He's currently president of the Research Committee of Sociology of Culture and the Arts for the Spanish Federation of Sociology. So thank you very much, Ricardo.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you so much to everyone in attendance. Good morning and good afternoon. This is the start. I want to thank Professor Caitlin Bruce for her work and for this project and all these activities we've been promoting the last couple of years. And thanks, Eric, for all your organizing work. I'm sorry, I can't be there present physically, and no puedo. I couldn't travel because of some personal issues, but I will be able to be there in Pittsburgh in another opportunity. I'd like to share with you my screen. As it was mentioned, I will have a very short presentation about Artivism in a city like Barcelona, where tourism and what they call processes of gentrification play a very important role. And this is kind of an overview of the presentation. We'll go through this quickly. The general idea and objectives that we want to present today under a logic of what happens in our cities today, rapidly think in what we think of artivism. It's a movement. It's not a homogeneous movement. It looks to recognize our social problems in the city, inside the public spaces, through resistance measures. We could call them cultural actions. This kind of practices have become a representation, or it's translated as a representation of identity, community identity, or neighborhood identity, citizen participation. That's very important. And where we establish a critical vision, a transformative in the social model, the political and economic model that is active in those cities. And so very quickly, what I'm proposing are three different objectives. The first one is to reflect about these transformative cultural practices. Artivism has to be transformative. If not, it's not Artivism, where we have to emphasize social and political aspects according to the local context. And the second part suggests some ideas about what kind of city do we want according to the context that we actually have. If we think of the city and the public spaces, making up the environment of each neighborhood, each family, each place, what influence does tourism have, or gentrification have against this kind of dynamic? Barcelona is considered a tourist city. Since some time ago, it was touristified. It's a massive amount of tourism, so that the city itself has trouble dealing with it. And finally, we think about the use of public spaces as interactive spaces. So if there's no citizen participation, then those spaces and this activist vision is weakened. Otherwise, when we recognize that participation at the local level, in una comunidad, in a neighborhood, that's what we're aiming for. So quickly explain a little bit about our methodology, not just in this work, but in other works that have been developed in recent years. A strategy, qualitative, with techniques of collecting information through interviews, through activist interviews. They're qualified people who represent public administration, urban artists, of course, and cultural activists. And another strategy, this is linked to the archival information, is observation. For 1 hour, what we can observe, viendo and taking photographs on site in our cities throughout Latin America and Europe. The city in its context is what I was bringing up. Every city, every context, lost my slide, determines different kinds of public spaces. From my point of view, we need a change in the paradigm of transformation where the public spaces should have a tendency towards social interaction, more inclusive, more human, and that we have a right to the city to have a true protagonism. And just an aside, we're living historically this pandemic, and there was a time where we were confined. How do we think about public spaces without people? And just as an aside, we need to understand our current context and the moment that we're living in. So taking in account this development, these are 3 photographs. On the left, we have 3 women chatting in the Barcelonita neighborhood, where we talk about more inclusive spaces. This is an open air eating place in the Gracia neighborhood. And the last picture is a marketplace in the Barrabal neighborhood. So we can think of these activities. The city itself has to allow the development of these kinds of activities. And here we would incorporate Yangel, the Cuban, mentioned the use of urban spaces. And he characterizes 3 kinds of activities in public spaces. Three kinds of activities in public spaces. Very quickly, the necessary activities: you can go to work, to study, and we have to do it. We're obliged. We can't select to do that. The second one are the optional activities. We can choose to participate in them or not. Go into the streets, have a seat in a bench in the square. This is something we do inside the public spaces. And then we speak about social activities and social activity. It has people in public spaces, but these public spaces have to be adapted so that people can engage in these practices. In this case, there's a lot of examples. If there were no idea of how to do cultural activities in a public space in the Gracia neighborhood, you couldn't enjoy this kind of activity. And then other examples. Here I'd like to show you this, for example. This has to do specifically with Barcelona. Some years ago, they approved a law that what we called it locally the gag law. So you couldn't have a public commentary in public spaces, and this action, there was a march in 2015 of an art collective. They marched silently, but using photographs as a way to demonstrate and their need to express themselves. So here we are, putting into focus tourism. It's a tourist city here. Just to give you some examples of what it means statistically, impact that tourism has in Spain and Barcelona specifically. I would say these are the most acceptable data because, well, after the pandemic, we didn't really have much travel. So these figures are from 2018. In 2018, Spain was in the second place in the world for the countries most visited by tourists. At the same time, if we think about how tourism affects the GDP in these countries, Spain is also in second place with 14.3% of the GDP that depending on the contribution of tourism. So in looking at cities, looking at this in an urban point of view, Barcelona is the most significant city in Spain that has income from tourism. It's one of the top 25 in the world. And every year, when these last years that were where they were measured, we had 8.3 billion euros coming in. And among the cities most visited in Europe, Barcelona is in second place. So with this information, we can see very clearly the weight and the need for tourism in the city. And this has resulted because of some policies by public administration where they have called it the brand of Barcelona, the Barcelona brand. So this is the model that they've used since the 1980s, where the city has begun to place significant cultural events, sports events, technological events that show off the city to the world. One of the discussion points has to do with that we don't want to associate ourselves with the consumer product. And so there's some antagonism here. It's you know, like the Olympics in '92, the World Forum of Culture, other mega events that occur here year to year and linked to all this with consumer, with the tourism consumption. We also have traditional visits to cultural sites, heritage sites, museums, and this aims to satisfy local tourists and also international tourists as a way to manage tourism. And here, well, continuing on, just to show a few indications of how public spaces can also become places of protest. On the left, we have the official poster for the festival La Merced, which is the most important festival that Barcelona has. And then on the right of the slide, you can see an activist's poster that, well, I took the photo in a public plaza. This is, you can see how they took this idea and are criticizing this brand of Barcelona with the Dracula's teeth and the blood, showing how this is a product of this tourism. You can see the Holy Family. You can see the airplanes that represent the tourists coming in. You can see the symbol of Barcelona 92 and others relevance for the city. Another common symbol that you see every day, but it's also invisible in a certain way, has to do with these small changes that, you know, when I mentioned the neighborhoods and just the design shows the appropriation of these public spaces. And then we have the creativity shown of the city, but it also enters into this everyday objects, the kiosk, the newspaper kiosk that we're showing here, that has things available for the family, that for people who live in the neighborhood, and it begins to transform, but it begins to become more commercial, less personal. On the publications are the ones you would get in an airport. They've got a lot of photography, but not much content, so to speak, in where you would go and get a coffee and some juice. And slowly, these little urban spaces are starting to invade our public spaces. And speaking of tourism again, public art also gives us new opportunities. In the Pobleno neighborhood, what they used to call these like around Manchester, because this is where we had a lot of industrial output and mills. And many of these industries were later taken over by artists once they had closed, and they have their living quarters there, but also recreational spaces. And you can see in the picture on top, there's a wall which was a part of a project, Free Walls in Barcelona. In 2005 and 2006, they began to prohibit many activities in public spaces. And as a consequence, there was control over that kind of activity. And these kinds of projects were, we then allowed these kinds of spaces so that artists could express themselves without getting fined. And the photo below, there's some routes drawn up that are more institutionalized, where tourists can take guided routes. So it's a map that's presented. It was presented in to show the active memory of the city as it's mapped in its day-to-day activities. Some answers to all this in terms of artivism. This picture in the Catalan language, it says, para mí, for me, the feminist fiestas are those where I can show my love to who I want and how I want. So here we can think in some discussion points. For one side, public space is a place for interaction. It's not considered a public space as a transitional space. It's a place to build community, to build neighborhoods. It's a language, participatory, that allows this movement, Artivism. There's no worry about aesthetics. That's not the main concern, aesthetics. The concern is, above all, breaking hegemony, identifying, as the photo showed, the injustices, inequalities. And here the second point is this transforming action that has to accompany citizen participation. The citizenry has to be there, has to accompany artists' actions, because if they don't, then we've got that third point. There has to be a sense of belonging, a sense of reference, self-recognition. That's to say, what the artivists are showing isn't necessarily happening to us. There's a social problem, of course, but it has to be discussed. It's a reality that has to be seen more clearly among all of us. And here, I wanted to show some of the experience of Artivism. In some cases, recognition of parts of our community, parts of our neighborhoods, and in other cases linked to the problem with living quarters in Barcelona. So this one, who are we? This was a project that we undertook in San Pedro, Santa Catarina, in Barcelona. It's very similar to the research that we showed in the opening conference. Using the walls, we can make our neighbors visible. And also what we're looking to do is reinforce the community network where there's a narrative, there's an environment. We are part of this neighborhood and this area. It's a recognition of the multicultural reality and we recognize the collectives that are part of this individual or all of these neighborhoods. That's part of this project. Another project that has a similar line is Raval Indoor. There's a logic, there's communication between private spaces in a neighborhood. Well, in this case, in the barrio Raval, the Raval neighborhood, and there's a link between the private life with public spaces, the public life, where through this photographic project, what we wanted to obtain was to visualize the community and show the day-to-day life. A persona that every day washes their clothes, the person in the lower photo, an individual who's retired and is watching TV. But the idea here is that that's how we build the neighborhood, this environment. And so this is our third one, our third example. This was very interesting, this project a few years back when we had the housing crisis, the housing bubble, especially in Barcelona, but in all of Spain. And we started to create internationally the mortgage crisis that we had. And people started to go to the banks. This was with the Barcelona bank. Ahora it's a larger bank. It's a private bank where the people would go to the banks and they would give a postcard of the picture whose housing was affected. And here's a space to write. So the person in the photograph, that's a real person. It says Jairo Morales is the one who owns this building, but he had to stop. And that's why he hasn't been paying his payments anymore. He's trying to negotiate with the bank, but the bank will not reply to him. So, but they're suing him because he hasn't paid. So Jairo and the other people will write on his postcard, and they send these to the bank directors. Now, there was no response really, but through this activist activity was to show this serious activity was happening at the time. Just to close and to have some final thoughts dealing with today's subject. On one side, this looks really important to look at what happens in the day-to-day. We all have a mental map of our day-to-day. And when these kinds of initiatives come out, it tries to break up this day-to-day. This is important, and it goes hand in hand with this idea of looking at the city in a different way, that the right to the city is inalienable, that these social activities, we all have the right, not just to live, to socially occupy these spaces, but to declare ourselves in these spaces, this geographical space. It comes into question. We have to give visibility to the individuals and also to our community organizations, but within our own spaces, our own neighborhoods. And this idea has to be visible. Finally, the need for participatory actions. This is a place for actions, the public space, not just for individuals. It's a place to encounter others and to share collectively. So that's just, these are just a few references. The first one has to do with the project that we're undertaking right now with La Professora Caitlin. And there are others, activities with Joaquim Rius del año pasado y otras referencias adicionales. And thank you all. And here are some of our contact information. And thank you all, and looking forward to the rest of the event.
Yeah. In the chat, there's a question from one of the translators, so maybe check on that while I do our next introduction. All right, thank you so much. So our next presenter will be Dr. Amanda Boston, whose talk is titled Subtlety, Race Making, Refinement, and Redevelopment in Brooklyn. Dr. Boston is an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies. Her research, writing, and teaching focus on 20th century and contemporary African-American urban history, politics, and popular culture. Her book project is entitled The New New York, Race, Space, and Power in Gentrifying Brooklyn, and explores the racial operations of gentrification in her hometown of Brooklyn, New York. In it, she illuminates how histories of race and structural racism and the rise of colorblindness and neoliberalism have shaped the making and the unmaking.
El liberalismo han dado forma a la creación y la expresión de las comunidades negras del distrito.
Boston has received research funding and support.
Boston ha recibido financiación y apoyo.
The Social Science Research Foundation, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, among other sources. She received her PhD and MA in Africana Studies from Brown University, as well as her MA in Political Science and BA in Political Science and African American Studies from Duke University. Boston is a trustee emerita of Brown University, an alumni trustee of New York City-based PrEP program, and a member of the board of directors of the Municipal Society of New York. Before joining the University of Pittsburgh, she was a provost postdoctoral fellow at New York University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Boston.
Good morning, everyone. You prefer this camera or the other? Whatever will let me easily change the slides. Yep. Okay. Keeping it real.
It's like the infinite mirror.
Thank you. So I just do share screen?
Yep, and then choose your presentation.
Thank you.
Then you could go to presentation.
Okay. This is fancy. All right. Good morning again. It's good to see everyone here. And thank you especially to Professor Caitlin Bruce for such a warm welcome to Pittsburgh in my first year here and for inviting me to participate in these important conversations. So this morning, I'll be discussing contemporary artist Kara Walker's 2014 art exhibit at the now defunct Domino Sugar Factory in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which was commissioned by local arts nonprofit Creative Time. At the time of the exhibit's opening, the factory was scheduled for demolition to make way for a $3 billion 11-acre complex on the East River waterfront. And just for those of you who are not familiar with New York geography, the East River is what separates Brooklyn from the island of Manhattan. So the project was intended to respond to the facility and its history. Oh, and this is a picture of the decommissioned Domino Sugar Factory. Okay, this is back in 2011, so just 3 years before the installation. And this is the $3 billion 11-acre complex that is now well underway, for the record. There's still some construction going on, but it's well underway. And so this project, this art installation that Kara Walker put together was intended to respond to the facility and its history. And so she named it A Subtlety, or the marvelous sugar baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. And at its center stood a massive sugar-coated sphinx turned mammy, a figure that evoked not only local and global histories of sugar production and consumption, but also the interlocking systems of domination with the late Black feminist theorist and cultural critic Bell Hooks terms, the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, right? That continues to define and shape life and human relations in much of the world. And so my remarks will sort through Subtlety's many layers, particularly how the project materializes global and local histories of gendered and racialized exploitation, consumption, and disposability, as well as the foundational role of Afro-descendant people in the making of the modern world. I'm also interested in the complex politics of the installation itself, which reflect the fraught role of art as both a potentially liberatory enterprise and one that is often easily co-opted and commodified into processes that run counter to liberation. A Subtlety pushes viewers to locate themselves within current processes of displacement and erasure, and to recognize their complicity in structures that destroy people and places to satiate their demands and desires. Confronting these dynamics constitutes a necessary intervention into colorblind, triumphalist narratives of history and capitalism, and sheds a necessary light on Black New Yorkers' struggles against gentrification and determination to resist erasure. So Williamsburg, Brooklyn has a long history as a racially and ethnically diverse enclave. Picking up after World War II, a concurrent influx of European Jews and Puerto Ricans transformed the area into a predominantly Hasidic and Puerto Rican enclave. While members of the former diaspora were largely fleeing war and persecution, many of the latter were fleeing the decline of agriculture on the island and a devastating economic depression. The administration of Charles Herbert Allen, who from 1900 to 1901 was the first US civilian to serve as Puerto Rico's governor, had been a key turning point in Puerto Rico's fiscal decline. During his brief tenure, he opened up the island to US business ventures, installed hundreds of US visitors and expats into the Puerto Rican government, and redirected economic resources for his personal benefit and for that of US business elites, bureaucrats, and the US government. Once out of office, Allen leveraged his power and connections to build the American Sugar Refining Company, alternately known as the Sugar Trust. By 1907, that empire owned or controlled 98% of the sugar processing capacity of the United States. In a short time, most of Puerto Rico's arable land was converted to sugar plantations. And thanks to the near complete dominance of US-owned sugar syndicates, there occurred a massive transfer of land and wealth from small farmers in Puerto Rico to businesses and banks headquartered on Wall Street. In the more than a century since Allen left office, the island nation has yet to recover from policies and practices of exploitation and dispossession that he set in motion. Today, the massive company he grew is named Domino Foods Incorporated, the parent company of Domino Sugar. Many of the Puerto Ricans who made a home in Williamsburg had previously worked on the plantations and in the factories that had made sugar a bedrock of the island's economy. And although Puerto Rico's African heritage and experience with slavery have often been minimized with a sort of whitewashing on their own, many were the descendants of enslaved and free Africans and Afro-Puerto Ricans who had cultivated and processed sugarcane on the island for centuries. Settling around the Domino Sugar Factory and other industrial facilities in which they found work in Brooklyn, they, along with smaller groups from the Caribbean and Central and South America, were the artisans, to borrow a term from the exhibit title, who transformed their slice of South Williamsburg into Los Sures, a haven for Latinx and Afro-Latinx community and culture amidst drastic post-war economic, ideological, and racial shifts. When deindustrialization, disinvestment, civic neglect, rising crime, and white flight appeared to seal Williamsburg's fate as yet another casualty of the urban crisis, they and other residents stayed put and remained active in the fight to preserve, protect, and improve their communities against all odds. In many ways, the abandonment and demolition of the Domino factory mirrors the precarious futures of historically marginalized residents of New York City, including majority poor, Black, and brown Brooklyn communities like those in Los Lures and nearby Bedford-Stuyvesant, Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, and Bushwick. As the world changes around them at what looks and feels like lightning speed, many nonetheless hold on to hope that a place exists for them while the city marches forward in the name of progress. Faced with the same promises and policies of redevelopment, they too face uncertain futures as victims of a 21st century colonial project under the guise of neoliberal redevelopment. Amidst willful and unintended ignorance about these difficult and brutal histories and their contemporary impact, Walker's installation masterfully lays them bare, tying ongoing processes of displacement and marginalization to exploitation and dispossession in the not so distant past. Inside the refinery, a subtlety made powerful linkages between the local politics of diaspora, development, and displacement and the global histories of racial capitalism much more readily apparent. Part racist caricature, part deity, and coated with more than 160,000 pounds of pure white sugar of questionable origin, the sugar sphinx quite literally appeared to glow in the dark. Her full lips and high cheekbones gave her an unmistakable African identity, and with eyes that seemed to be either looking out or transfixed, she surveyed the warehouse, the dozen 5-foot-tall molasses attendants that bore offerings of sugarcane and other crops, and the moving crowds of visitors that comprised her kingdom. On her head, she wore a handkerchief that brought the iconic Great Sphinx of Giza into the New World context, evoking the mammy archetype that portrayed enslaved Black women and domestic servants as unquestioningly devoted to the care and well-being of white families, disdainful of their own families, and ultimately satisfied with the status quo of racial inequality. With her bare breasts exposed in front and her buttocks and labia exposed in the back, the Sphinx also animated the controlling image of the Jezebel, overdetermined by her sexuality and reproductive capacity. The bluntness of these representations, coupled with her sheer size, 75.5 feet long, 35.5 feet high, and 26 feet tall, commanded the awe of each visitor. Much has been written about the role of sugar, or white gold, as the British called it, as the primary engine of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the foundational role of sugar in the development of the modern world system of racial capitalism. The title of the installation is drawn from the edible sugar sculptures, subtleties, that adorned aristocratic banquets in England and France in the Middle Ages, when sugar was a luxury commodity reserved for only the wealthiest Europeans. First on Madeira and the Canary Islands, and eventually in the tropical climates of the New World, large-scale sugar plantations forever altered the fabric of every nation in the Caribbean, much of South America, and parts of the southern United States, and of course, the rest of the world. The processes involved in year-round sugar cultivation were so notoriously difficult and brutal that the fight against its horrors and the related systems of racial slavery, capitalism, and colonialism produced the first successful slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere and the first Black republic in the world. A safe distance, at least physically, from the dehumanizing conditions of sugar plantations, mills, and boiling and curing houses to the south, sugar was also the industry that elevated old New York, helping transform it into a cosmopolitan, powerful financial center in the 1700s. By the mid-19th century, the refineries on the Brooklyn waterfront were processing most of the sugar in the country, thereby cementing Brooklyn's status as the nation's refining capital. Local banks and insurance companies supported the wealth of prominent sugar traders and refiners. Their fortunes, in turn, were invested in gaslight, cable lines, railroads, distant colonial empires, and slave labor. Today, 730,000 descendants of enslaved, freed, freeborn, and self-liberated Africans reside in Brooklyn. Their presence, particularly since the latter half of the 20th century, has made the borough home to one of the nation's largest contiguous Black communities and a true crossroads of the African diaspora. Though the precise structures that constrain Black life in the borough have undoubtedly changed significantly since the height of the Domino refinery's usage and fame, the persistence of race as a mechanism of social power, and one that singles out people of African descent for unique and severe forms of exploitation, marginalization, and punishment, has remained a powerful determinant of their life chances and opportunities. Whereas imperialist projects once built vast wealth and entire nations on the backs of African slaves and other enslaved and colonized people around the world, today the effects of racialized space, targeted disinvestment, and other mechanisms that maintain and deepen structural racial inequality have enabled the systematic class and racial remaking of US cities. And as in previous eras, public and private elites often overlook or disregard the human toll of such projects and instead use capital gains as a proxy for progress. Black feminist scholars and others have long analyzed how racial capitalism is structured by gender relations and how Black women have fared in the context of racial, class, and gender domination from slavery and colonialism to the present. For example, although women and men certainly shared responsibility for the exhausting labor of sugarcane cultivation, as Walker's Sphinx forces us to reckon with, enslaved women bore the unique responsibility of forced childbearing and were also overwhelmingly the targets of slave drivers and overseers' sexual opportunism. The legacies of these gender roles are found in the prevalence of the titillating vixen, the trope that still serves as a dominant controlling image of Black women in the white imaginary. Bringing it still closer to home, the image of the Sphinx and her attendants also highlights the caretaking role many Black women continue to play in the present. As Tamara Mose writes in Raising Brooklyn, for example, Black women childcare providers are a staple in the New York economy and an increasingly visible presence in Brooklyn, as many make a living as housekeepers and caretakers for children of the borough's growing white middle and upper middle class populations. And of course, a subtlety itself, designed by one of the foremost Black women artists of our time, signals the artistic contributions and creative genius of Black women, unlike any piece of public art before and likely since. Still, with a host of images typically used to control and degrade Black women and to materially and symbolically devalue their labor, blown up into a worship-worthy sculpture, Walker makes viewers sit with the uncomfortable ambiguity of its purpose. Is the decision to transpose the denigrated mammy figure with that of a ferocious and powerful monster a transgressive one? Does the use of stereotypical features simply rehash dangerous tropes that distort the image of Black people in the white imagination? Does the outsized nature of the sculpture indicate dominance? Or does her position, naked and leaning on her elbows and knees, show that she's submissive? Do her exposed private parts demonstrate her sexual availability? Or is she essentially giving her audience her butt to kiss? The Sugar Sphinx's left hand was sculpted into the fig sign. See if I can get a better image of the fig. You kind of see it there. With the thumb placed between the fore and middle fingers. And this sign is a fertility and good luck charm, as well as a gesture commonly used to deny a request or ward off the evil eye. And it's actually the only remaining piece of the statue. And that fact, along with her decision to film and publicize the spectators' often irreverent and explicit reaction to the Sphinx's private parts, seems to confirm the latter. Though she's not an unpaid artisan by any means, I believe that Carol Walker, a Fort Greene transplant, is also implicated in the ambiguity of the piece. Criticized as a darling of the white-dominated art world, and having made a career with pieces that feature all sorts of brutal racist tropes, many have questioned whether she, like the Sphinx, is a truly transgressive artist or simply a handmaiden of empire. While art certainly plays a powerful role in consciousness raising, the politics of the exhibit reveal the fraught conditions under which many of today's Black artisans operate, especially as their work is increasingly used to lure in capital and consumers and is capable of generating unprecedented profit. For example, the refinery site developer, Two Trees Management, the most active developer in Brooklyn, was headed by David Walentis, the billionaire real estate mogul credited with transforming Dumbo, neighborhood down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, from an industrial site to the most expensive neighborhood in Brooklyn. His son, Jed Walentis, was chief executive officer of Two Trees Management, as well as co-chairman of the board of directors of Creative Time. The firm behind the new development's design is Shop Architects of Barclays Center and Pacific Park of fame. Pacific Park is the mega development of which the Barclays Center Sports and Entertainment Arena, where the Nets play, the Brooklyn Nets play, is located. And the designer of Domino Park is the architectural firm behind the High Line, which is the engine of hypergentrification in Manhattan's West Chelsea neighborhood. Thus, despite the importance and validity of such a critique of the political economy of racial capitalism and contemporary gentrification, Walker's art is undoubtedly made visible, and her reputation and influence increased by an intricate web of the devastating powers and institutions she exposes. So a subtlety reminds viewers that the past is always present. Although much of Brooklyn today appears new, it is difficult to comprehend the present or possible futures without reference to the struggles that the exhibit and its surroundings embody. A chaotic interplay of race, ethnicity, sexuality, wealth inequality, abjection, and power. A subtlety tells a story that begins with the relationship between slavery and the triumph of industrial capitalism, and explores the movement of people and commodities, and sometimes people as commodities. It also brings viewers face to face with the ravages of globalization and deindustrialization, as well as the human toll of urban renewal and gentrification. At once monumental and grotesque, the installation honors millions of nameless, faceless people whose lives and labors have been widely consumed and taken for granted. Reflecting on their sacrifices, fates, and significance offers insight into the misworkings of political, economic, and racial projects that use capital gains as a proxy for progress and human well-being. And as Black and other marginalized people struggle to find their place, literally and figuratively, in Brooklyn's new image, Walker's work encourages us to think more deeply about what is at stake, the truth of our stories, who will tell them, and how they'll be told. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So our next speaker will be Gina Obando. Gina is from the organization Gráfica Mestiza, which is located in Cali, Colombia. So passionate about Latin American urban art, a designer, a cultural programmer, a researcher, and a producer, Obando belongs to the team Gráfica Mestiza, La Grafiteria, and the Mesa de Gráfica Urbana in Cali, Colombia. Gina has participated in developing social projects with DirecTV, Club, Festival Borondo, the Week of Urban Graphics, among other events. She's been an invited speaker to the SIMU Festival that was hosted at the UNAM in Mexico City and the University of Palermo in Argentina. Currently, she's participating in artistic development programs with the Bibliothèque Foundation and the Itinerant Artist School at Argelia Cauca, the Global Glow Club, and is coordinator for the project Youth Filling the Region with Color, a project under the Cooperación Mundial de la Mujer Colombiana. So thank you so much for joining us, Gina.
Hello.
Hola, buenos días.
Hello, good morning.
Primero, muchísimas gracias
First,
por la
thanks so much to
presentación,
Dr. Caitlin
a la traductora,
and
a
our
las
interpreters,
personas que nos están acompañando en el
the people who
panel
are
y
joining us on the panel, and the other
gracias por la
invitees.
invitación.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Bueno, ahorita me encuentro
Right
en un
now,
lugar como
I'm in a
de la selva,
place like it's
en el Guaviare, San José
out
Guaviare,
there
entonces, como para
in the
tener un
jungle.
poco
It's
de conectividad,
gives me a bit more of a connectivity.
cámara, bueno.
So I'm going to turn the camera down.
Bueno,
Okay.
voy a hablar sobre
So I'm going to talk a little bit
la gráfica.
about
Lo llamé la gráfica, no se rinde
the
carajo.
graphic. Don't give up, damn it.
Y voy a contarles un poco sobre.
And I'm going to tell you a little bit about, hold on.
Voy a contarles
I'm going to
sobre los proyectos
tell you a
que he
little bit about
participado.
the projects I've been
La
participating
gráfica
in,
mestiza,
the graphic
inició
project Mestiza,
como
that
con la idea de
started with
documentar el
the
trabajo
idea of
gráfico
documenting the
en
working
Latinoamérica
of
y en Cali.
urban graphics in
Siempre
Latin
que
America and
buscábamos en
Cali.
Google,
If you go into
veíamos que
Google,
cuando
you can
buscábamos,
see
hablaba de graffiti, de urban
lots of
artists,
urban graphic artists in the United States and other countries, but for Latin America, it's not being documented. And we saw that there's a lot of things going on here. So that's how Gráfica Mestiza was born, to start collecting what's going on in Latin America and disseminate it. This is a means of communication that has different aspects of the work. From it has an editorial part where we collect all the latest graphic productions in Latin America. We have our virtual store, part of interviews and communications, and an informative spot where there are festivals to announce and activities. And the last project is our Mestiza School. Also, we produce books. This is the first one that came out. Before making the publications, we also started to produce these books, and we realized that thinking about the economy, we realized that it took as long to do a book as it did a magazine, so we started doing books. So this is from a collection of graphic artists from Cali, because we realized that part of the problem in the graphic area, the artists didn't know each other. So this book was born, and we asked people to submit their work, and they got to know each other. Our next project was the Borondo Festival. Well, this festival came about in 2017. It's self-prepared with a union of graphic artists in the city. And I say it's done by the artists themselves, because what we have done is have trade among the artists. We get resources and living space for the artists who are coming in. What we would do is talk to the business and the artist, and we would get the living arrangements made for the artist. And in that way, we also had a restaurant for the artists and other spaces for work. In this festival, this image here, this is from the first festival in the San Pascual neighborhood. We were looking at a particular problem. They're starting to renew the city, and what they're doing is starting to buy neighborhood houses. And this, in fact, is one of the first neighborhoods in Cali. So they go in, they buy the houses,
y le suben el estrato para
they rebuild them, and then raise all the rents.
en este lo que se quería con
So in this place, what we were doing with the Borondo Festival was to centralize
urbano siempre se pintaba con
urban art and urban
naturales,
graphic artists
pero
in using the principal streets.
queríamos llegar
And
más a los barrios y
we did want to get out to all of the neighborhoods and to the community, working with those communities.
por acá les muestro también.
Here's another sample.
Luego llega pandemia
Later, after the pandemic arrives,
el circuito gráfico de Cali.
we created the
eh,
graphic circuit
como
of
más
Cali.
enfocado en el turismo cultural,
And this is more linked to cultural tourism.
programación de recorridos por murales y
So we have routes through the city of Cali and look at relevant cultural aspects. And unfortunately, we had to close our building. So we organized these kinds of walks through the city, not just the way to see the murals, but explaining how the artist works and teaching them how to read the meaning in these graphic artworks. And we also did some visits to other cultural spaces that were open during the pandemic, so they wouldn't close. The interesting part of this project was there are a lot of spaces where the city's people, they didn't know it before. It was like the first time it found these spaces. And the other interesting part was they were very pleased with this because they began to get to know the artists, why they were painting, understand a little more about what they were seeing on their streets. And so the objective was to see the city through different eyes. And what came out of this was a board of directors, and we created this poster and put these up in a place called Linterno. This is one of the editorials, one of the largest printers in Latin America. And here's where we would put on the information about the artists. The idea was to exhibit and circulate all this information. So this is the La Linterna, the editorial, the printers that we mentioned, the publisher. This is where urban artists and designers began arriving here to prepare their works. Also, as part of the circuit, we organized a cultural agenda. Here's an example of one of the expositions that we'd organized. And we did some walking tours and others in riding bicycles because of the social distancing. Another of the projects that came about after the pandemic was this feminist graphic art. This is referring to kidnapping of women, systematic kidnapping. And among all of us in the main roads on Cali, realizing these kidnappings, and we prepared this mural that says Cali kidnaps women. And this became a kind of a slogan about a problem that we could alert the population to about the kidnapping of women. And this happens in April. And this was, it reached the great amount of publicity throughout the city. Then we had the national strike during the COVID pandemic. This was on April 28th, where we had the national strike. This strike was a protest because of the tax changes in both Cali and Bogota, but it had far-reaching consequences and throughout the country. Where I live, this was the epicenter of this protest, thanks to this reform of the tax code. And people went out to demonstrate our disagreement. And there were lots of movements that joined us, for the movement for women, on behalf of animals, and others. So all of the neighborhoods also participated in the marches. And I felt that they hadn't done it as often in the past, but now all the neighborhoods were coming out to protest. And these protests arrived and went from south to north through all the main streets of the city. And then it spread out to different parts of the city. And they started to use public spaces, and each public space began to obtain its own identity. One that was called the open door became a resistance door. There was another that called the Bridge of 1,000 Doors, and it started to be called the Bridge of 1,000 Challenges. And, por ejemplo, so in Cali, in this area here, they built this monument. This were the youth. On the left, you can see the fist lifted that has a sign saying to resist. The collectivity and many joined into with this protest specifically. Welders, urban artists, community members in general, and they created this particular sculpture together and began to build other collectives, other types of monuments in their communities. That was created in every point where there were resistance activities. So for me, this was something very important, an important part of this strike. All these collectives were able to, every single day, have social projects and also to feed a lot of people with these communal kitchens. So it was quite revolutionary, in fact. So this was with the women's groups, the feminist group, with the silk screening. Where we would silk screen messages related to the strike, like life before anything, like respecting life. And also during this strike, a lot of the common dynamics began to change as far as urban spaces. because we started to get a great many of the walls involved. This space, for example, had never been painted prior to this because it wasn't allowed, or if you put something there, they would immediately take it down. So the artists began to be able to put their graphic messages. This one, for example, is a Christian church wall. Then these kinds of spaces were starting to be taken. This particular wall, Todavía, it still is very active for our urban artists and graphic artists. And as far as the strike, a lot of the urban artists did come out, but others didn't because they're head of a family. But the ones who did come out is that a lot of new artists started to appear as well. They were coming out onto the streets and they began to what I would call just the creation of new artists. You would see a lot in terms of graphic art, lots of block letters, maybe because they were painting rapidly and it was a time when they wanted to speak. So you would see these very large messages written in block letters. Also, they started to convert, and this is an example, these police posts into places of resistance and little public libraries. This, for example, is a small library on Dignity Hill. And well, in the streets, when we went out, we would always see some graphic artists. Would accompany them, take photographs, film, and stay with them until they were able to finish their work. And I felt that taking care like this, the feminists also would participate in this. And what they would say to the police is, I take care of my friends. And we would always be present until the artists were able to finish and complete their work, because in any moment the riot police could show up and or other popular mobs that could kill people who were out protesting in the streets. So we took care of each other. And I think that the group of feminists supported us greatly whenever we would go out to the streets. Well, we were a little bit afraid, but all of us felt fear going out to the streets, seeing what was happening. So I thought a lot about that. So May 3rd arrived that early that morning, and our friend Flit was murdered by his mob. And starting with that event, people began to paint quite a bit. I'm sorry. And the sector of artists, many more joined in, and they started painting and painting even in other countries. So starting with the Borondo Festival, we realized that we started to collect
dándonos cuenta de que
and
mucha gente está aportando.
realizing that a lot of people are out there
Y pues,
creating works.
como que era la manera
And it
de
was
demostrar
the way
que
to
nuestro amigo vive,
demonstrate that our
que
friend was
nuestra amiga
still
está
with us and he was living in the streets.
por acá. Este es el punto
And this
de
is
resistencia.
one of our points of resistance.
Lo pintó uno de sus amigos.
Still one of our friends had painted this from his
Frío.
collective.
Y bueno, con esto finalizo.
And with that, I've arrived to the end.
Pues todos quedamos. Cuidarse todos
And,
y avisar
and
cuando lleguen a sus
so
casas.
take care, everyone, and let us know when you get home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. And Gina shared a couple of videos with me that I'll put in the chat and also email out to you also to watch them on your own later. So we're going to conclude with a presentation from Dr. Ligia Ferro. Dr. Ferro completed her graduation studies at the Faculty of Arts, University of Porto, receiving the Antonio de Almeida UP Award for the best student graduating in sociology in 2004. In 2011, she received her European PhD from the University Institute of Lisbon, ISCTEIUL. Dr. Ferro's research develops the ethnographic and other mixed methods approaches, and lately she's been working on cultural practices, arts education, migration, socio-professional integration, and action research, especially in urban contexts. She was a visiting scholar at several universities in Europe, the United States of America, and Brazil. And currently she's assistant professor in the sociology department, Faculty of Arts, at the University of Porto. She conducted research with an FCT postdoc grant at the Institute of Sociology, UP, and in the Center for Research and Studies in Sociology, CIES-IUL. She's carried out fieldwork in Porto, Lisbon, Barcelona, Paris, New York, Boston, and Rio de Janeiro. And Dr. Ferro was elected president of the European Sociological Association from 2021 to 2023, was the ESA Research Network 37 Urban Sociology Coordinator from 2015 to 2017, and is a member of the board of the European Network of Observatories in the fields of arts and cultural education at UNESCO since September 2017. She is author and editor of several publications, including the book Moving Cities, Contested Views on Urban Life, 2018 Springer, and the article Jump Lisbon, Notes from an Ethnography of Urban Flows, 2015 Portuguese Journal of Social Science. She's also the editor of the book series Anno Yearbooks at Springer. Her talk today is titled Pressure on People, People on Streets, Creativity, Politics of Urban Public Space, and Street Cultures. Thank you, Dr. Ferro.
Thank you very much. It's a big pleasure to be here. My special thanks to Professor Caitlin Bruce and also to Professor Ricardo Klein for the invitation, and also for the support by the Global Studies Center. Final thanks to Eric McDandang for supporting the logistics of an intercontinental travel, which is not so easy. Also the interpreters and the audience. So for today, I choose to speak a little bit from my work published as a part of the book From the Street to the World, Urban Ethnography on Graffiti and Parkour. And this work was developed over the last years in other research projects with other research collaborators. The main objective of this work was focusing strategies of organization, of planning and control of urban public space. And while we were also trying to grasp the strategies by the graffiti writers to claim their right to the city. So in dialogue with other presentations here this morning, especially with Professor Klein presentation. We applied research methodology based on urban ethnography, of course, using techniques of participant observation, interviews, document analysis, and social photography, which we use a lot. And I see that everyone also in this conference is really pretty much into photography as a tool for collecting information and analyzing the social reality. So the starting point here, let me just try to take this from the title. The starting point for this small reflection is to think about cities in the late capitalism. We know that cities have been subject to several strategies of hygienization, trying to clean certain areas from the poor, from the lower and working class people. Also the tendencies of commercialization. This has a long time, and we continue to see several examples of that in different cities in the world. Now we have also the hypervigilance in the city. In the end, I will also refer to that again. And this becomes the city a complex place to live, especially if you are deprived from resources, economic, social, cultural resources. All other colleagues already said that touristification, retail consumption, capital accumulation in the city also are this big frame of production where public spaces are produced. And of course, we need to think that these tendencies are really constraining the production, but also the experiences of people in public spaces. Some urban planning strategies are designed to build this entrepreneur and liberal city, but at the same time, they threaten political movements. They also reinforce hygienization strategies of urban areas, expel popular classes from, as we saw here, from those places. So we see clearly that social inequalities in the living, the experience of the city, and also in the access of public spaces became exacerbated more and more with time. Let's see if I can change it. I don't know. Sorry. So we know that we have, as David Harvey noticed, we have this city built for the right people. So this is a big city built as a defensive city for the right people, the people that are in the right place and have the right to be there. But at the same time, we have the city of resistance, right? The people that are trying to subvert the norms of organization of space, the people that with their creativity are transforming the city in an enormous playground. As several authors working on urban cultures, not just urban art and graffiti, but also on skateboarding, other kind of urban cultures have been showing to us. So these urban cultures really generate alternative spaces of political, cultural, and artistic manifestations. And also they raise new insights and also they put into question some concepts such as being visible, invisible, concepts such as belonging and recognition, the concept of freedom, etc. And we saw here several examples of resistance from the presentations of Professors Ricardo, Amanda, also from Nina. So here we can see that the trialectics of space from Henri Lefebvre and Ricardo Klein already mentioned that can allow us analyze the power relations in the urban physical space, considering urban policy and planning, so the represented space, also the lived space and the symbolic representation of space. So by focusing policy, experiences, and representations of space, we can try to relate how policy constrains practices in the city, but also how people update and subvert the rules, expanding space possibilities. I work in different, with this framework in different cities, and well, I just choose an example for today, the Barcelona example. Also, Ricardo mentioned some projects from Barcelona, just to frame a little bit what I was proposing in the beginning. Barcelona is a good example of this defensive and at the same time playground city. It was projected in the international network of cities as a cosmopolitan city. This process started with an intense urban renewal project for the Olympic Games in 1992. This was intended to transform the city in a cozy metropolis, entrepreneur city, open to the occasional visitor, the tourists, etc. So the city started to appear as a cosmopolitan city where urban cultures like graffiti, skates, etc. had a special space. It was the kind of a mecca for graffiti writers for a while and for other protagonists of urban cultures. Including in 2005, it was defined as the more liberal and tolerant city in Europe. Everyone would go there to paint, including there was a wall in front of the Center for Contemporary Culture, the Contemporary Cultural Center of Barcelona, that was free by that time, by 2003 when I was there, working for this project. This process continued after the preparation for the Olympic Games, and this big project you can see there, the Fórum de las Culturas, Forum of Cultures. This is one of the buildings of a massive renewal project in the oriental part of Barcelona. So after the organization of this mega event, which expelled also a lot of population from this area of the city, mainly migrants and also gypsy communities, there were implemented more projects of urban renewal, expelling populations from other areas. So this was the starting point. Of course, there were discussions since the 90s on how Barcelona should think about the civism, the urban disorder, that there was a kind of lack of urbanity, so people didn't know how to behave in the public space. And after the Fórum de las Culturas, we started to have preparations for this new law of coexistence in the public space that, well, restricted a lot what people can do in the streets. This law, this municipal law, it was designed to preserve, and I'm quoting, preserve public space and a place of coexistence and civism. It was like a rationale for the regulation of practices in the public space. And it was based in the need of respecting cultural and social diversity, and by promoting the limitation of social interaction and also activities in the streets. Okay, so Barcelona is just an example. The strategy here was based on the theory of the broken windows. I imagine that all of you have heard about it. And all these discourses are really based on the image of this predatory city, where there is supposedly always in preparation the encounter between an aggressor and a victim. So this idea of insecurity that is also always present, even if there is not an objective data on that, such as in Portugal, for instance, one of the safest countries in the world, you still have a lot of this discourse of the predatory city, the violence that can be present, even if you don't see it, you are always reminded of this possibility. So in Barcelona, New York, and other cities, these protagonists of urban cultures have been built as signs of protagonists of disorder. They have been stigmatized. They are represented as central actors of urban insecurity. And important to say is that other cities that I studied in a comparative approach, such as Lisbon, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, New York, Paris, show that as the harder are urban policies, the most urban cultures, and particularly graffiti and urban art, is built as a tool of opposition to the system, as a tool of combating the system. And in the cities that you see a more inclusive policy, it's the reverse. So you see that opposition is not built. So this from a comparative approach, I think should be a starting point also to think about new policies for the future. In Barcelona, just to finish my example, we know that there are special places such as the Plaça dels Anjos and Raval. Ricardo already mentioned Raval at the beginning. This is a kind of a hard plaza where people are discouraged from being there. Even the way it's built, it's not built to enjoy that space. So it's more like a kind of a point of contemplation or access to the Museum of Contemporary Art than a place to enjoy. So as I told about just now about the urban policies, the more the urban cultures make a non-programmed use of the space and doing these resistances and building these resistances in a daily basis, the more you see the city transform into the playground city, in opposition to this well, perfect city designed for the right people. Well, and starting from this research in several cities, I was thinking that maybe I could bring more questions than answers, because we were discussing even yesterday that we are living in a moment of lots of crises and discontinuities, and how can we think about all this research that we have made, because we have lots of colleagues working on urban art, people doing urban art in the streets that have a lot of experience now. Now we are in a point that we really have a lot of information. We have produced a lot of knowledge and different kinds of knowledge, not just academic knowledge. And what we can think about the role of urban cultures and street practices in this post-COVID-19, and of course in this post-European conflict era that we don't know when it's going to happen to finish. We hope that is soon, but it's already marking a new time, a new era in the world. So, as I said in the beginning, the pandemic intensified a lot these hypervigilance systems in public space. We are being monitored, and the protagonists of urban cultures, of course, they work in the streets, and they are really worried with this hypervigilance. This is something that we need to be aware of, and as people working on street art and street cultures should think how can we contribute. Also to think about the regulation, because there is little regulation on this. Not to say that there is none at all, because in most of the cities we see this use of technology in public space and there is no regulation. So this is a new thing that maybe we could discuss. We know that research has been showing how social inequalities have been intensified by the application of these technologies to public spaces. And these social inequalities based on race, class, gender have been really intensified, mainly in these countries such as UK. We know that here in the US also there was a tendency to implement those tools, and now there was a discussion in the Congress, and well, it was reverted some of those measures, but we don't know really what is going to happen. So the question is, how can these protagonists cope with the new vigilance, and what strategies of resistance will be created to deal with that hypervigilance? At the same time, I would say which is our role as also as researchers and practitioners, our role in all this process of discussion about the application of technology and the vigilance of the public space. The final question I would bring also for discussion is was also thinking about the urban street practices and cultures and their role in this difficult moment. We know that social bonds were broken because of the pandemic, and we were deprived from social contact for a long time. And as I think it was Ricardo and other people also were saying before, urban practices and urban cultures work as a way of building community. And how can we envision now also these urban cultures as a way of rebuilding those bonds and as a glue to repair, to offer a space for this cultivation of bonds and sociabilities. So maybe also think together and discuss together a way of involving several people in the discussion of reconstruction of urban communities, how also we can try to influence urban policy to simulate those cultures and also those practices, because they can really make a difference in this very particular and difficult moment. Well, today I would bring more my experience from the past and also launch several questions for debate. And as the last speaker, I think it was perfect. Thank you very much.
So at this time, I'm going to invite Ligia and Amanda and Curry to join us up front. We have some moderated questions that we're going to ask them, and then we're going to open it up to the whole audience. All right, Curry.
All right, well, yeah, thank you to all the panelists. These were really
these were really wonderful presentations. And so the framing theme for this unconference is Beyond Crisis Creativity. And I think obviously one of the kind of, out of the many different crises we could identify, one of the major looming ones that we're still living with, going back to one of the questions that Dr. Ferro brought up at the end of her presentation, is the pandemic. And so I wanted to use that as a jumping off point and offer a question for all and any of the panelists. Obviously, the pandemic disrupted many aspects of daily life and dramatically altered people's relation to public space. This is something that we heard about in to different degrees in some of the presentations today. Last month, an article by Vijay Kolinjavati generated a lot of discussion online when he argued that the pandemic presented an opportunity to not just move on from a temporary decline in travel, but an opportunity to permanently do away with the mass tourism industry, a chance for undoing the destruction of local culture and community and exploitation of workers within the system that he refers to as extractive tourism. And I think this issue of extractive tourism is relevant to the cases that we've heard about today regarding the navigation of cultural practices, the appropriation of public space in these cities against the backdrop of tourism and gentrification. I also think of Dr. Boston's presentation and the example of a subtlety as being implicated in longer legacies of extraction and exploitation. So just broadly, I wanted to use this as a jumping off point to ask all of the panelists for their thoughts on the impact of the pandemic on public urban spaces, cultural practices, artivism, and not just in terms of the changes that may have been brought by the pandemic and the challenges that it poses, but also I'm specifically interested in any opportunities for reimagining and reconsidering either these phenomena or these different practices in these cities and more generally. So I guess whoever feels like jumping in.
I mean, we can also ask Ricardo. Ricardo, would you like to start us off, or should we?
Bueno, perfecto.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Well, yeah, on one side, I understand it could be an opportunity. I think that in reality, the process of thinking about public spaces as participatory spaces is part of a process that started before the pandemic. So what I think the pandemic did was make us rethink what was happening. I don't know if we went backwards a little bit. What Ligia says, this question of hypervigilance, this is an opportunity that for public administrations especially, this is an opportunity to begin to apply this kind of strategy of control of public spaces. So on the other hand, thinking in terms of tourism and cultural tourism in cities like Barcelona, it wouldn't be like an opportunity to put in place policies and strategies that somehow would limit these hyperactive tourism, because in fact, we're just beginning to see this similar tourism. It's like a metaphor that impacts what has to do with housing, with other factors related to a living city. As an impact of the pandemic, it's really interesting to me because it's an opportunity, but in reality, we have to see how you establish the dialogues, if they're possible, between the different actors that form part in an ecosystem, a cultural ecosystem, an amplified ecosystem, because otherwise it has to do more with cultural and artistic practices in public spaces that impact in the professional area. The pandemic, from my point of view, what this did was to increase the existing precariousness with the pandemic. We can see the precariousness of the artistic and cultural action. So this could be an opportunity to start to build cities' policy for urban public spaces, of course, in terms of cultural and artistic practices. Thank you.
I can also take a stab at that. I was in New York during the height of the pandemic, the epicenter of the crisis here in the US. And as ugly and miserable that time was, there was also a lot of beauty and creativity. And I think that shows just the persistence of the human and the determination of the human spirit, right? So even in hearing this question, the first public art I thought about was Brooklyn artist Aya Brown, a young woman from Brooklyn, and she painted these portraits of essential workers, and they had their J's on. They were like Black and brown women. Honestly, the first time I saw this art, I was like, oh, whoever did this is from Brooklyn, because it was just a very Brooklyn style, kind of round the way girl meets like COVID, essential worker superhero, and it was just this beautiful tribute to the, frankly, predominantly Black and brown women who are keeping the city going, from postal workers to nurses' aides and all that. So if you're at a computer, look her up, Aya Brown, Aya Brown, and the work was just beautiful. So I think of those moments where, art provides a way for people to say, we're still here, right? And to, paint either the bright side or some of the more difficult sides of what we're going through. But also, I think, I agree with the writer, and thank you for directing me to that article. I hadn't read it. That the pandemic was really a time where we could have reflected on a lot of opportunities to stop a lot of mess that's been going on, whether, it highlighted the need for access to universal health care, right? To stop shutting down and closing hospitals in marginalized communities to make way for condominiums and things like that. But it also provided, I think, an opportunity for us to see how capitalism thrives off of disorder, right? So even the tourism industry, like people were taking advantage of the lower flights to then lower flight prices rather, to then fly unvaccinated to countries that don't have the health infrastructure that we have, right? We saw the market go down and then bounce back. And again, in Brooklyn, we're all holed up in our homes, not knowing when we can leave, but I'm hearing construction in the distance to construct condominiums that no one in Bed-Stuy can afford, right? And so again, I think that one of the more painful lessons is that the extraction doesn't stop, that this extraction is a form of disorder. It thrives on misery. And as I think now of the housing crisis, as these moratoriums roll back, and we're also feeling some of the crisis, the aspects of the crisis that we're kind of, we put a cover on, for example. I'm really worried about what some of our most marginalized communities here, in New York, across the US and around the world, are going to deal as the world goes back to fake normal, right? So. Sorry to be a downer.
Maybe I can be more downer. I was also thinking about the different perspectives of pandemic. I made this research also with the graffiti writers in Porto on how they dealt with the pandemic, and some of them they survived from urban art and graffiti. So they had a lot of festivals and things. Of course, they are not rich people, but they can survive from that, some of them. And everything was canceled. So in this article I published in this publication from our research center, it was very clear that some of them were struggling to pay the rent, to eat, and so it was also interesting to see the solidarity networks between the graffiti writers to find some money for the ones that had no family support. And so it was really difficult, maybe for the privileged people that could just stay at home and the work from home. As you were saying, it was easier, or for the ones that had to continue to work and maintain the city working, it was difficult, even more difficult. But for the ones that could not even work, because there is a precariousness in this kind of activity, they don't have work contracts, or it's just as freelancers, they depend on these initiatives. It was really difficult for them, and now they are starting to get into the new normal, but it's not the same as before. And as Ricardo was saying, culture is in a big precarious situation right now in general. And this part of the field of culture that is not so recognized, it's not so legitimized, even worse, the situation is even worse. So maybe we also need to think about that. And sometimes also as privileged people, we see tourism only on the negative side. But when I speak with these graffiti writers, for instance, some of them say, okay, yes, there is a really bad side of tourism, it's hyper extractive, etc. But at the same time, it brings people and it brings some economic potentiality to the city. Of course, depends on the context that we are talking about. Of course, if we are talking about Barcelona or Paris, which are really, the tourism is really extractive and even negative and violent. But for other cities, not so affected by those hyperactive tendencies, tourism is also a good thing, because it can bring money and economic dynamics. So, we are in this difficult moment also for the graffiti writers and urban artists. And maybe this can be an opportunity to think, and us also as people involved in this field, trying to involve more with the discussion in public policy and try to alert for these problems.
Gina, do you want to add anything here, given that this is your field where you work, is developing cultural programming? Okay, looks like it's lost. Okay. All right. Do you have any other questions?
I have a somewhat related question in terms of time frame. So still thinking about kind of, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of the urban uprisings and global social justice protests that emerged, particularly in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And that carried with it not only instances of, first of all, masses of people in public space again, which was something that we had not seen for some months, but also protest messages and slogans being written on, appearing on the surfaces of the city, examples of memorialization and placemaking as part of that, whether it's the some of the notable examples from the US from that time would, the George Floyd Memorial mural in Minneapolis, the designation of Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, DC, even, in Pittsburgh, right? There's a Black Lives Matter mural being created during that time. So I guess I'm also curious in terms of looking back on this, on these last 2 years again, and we've heard various, we've heard about this aspect of how art can be a message of, can bring a message of protest, trying to disrupt hegemony, but also is very easily commodified and appropriated. And so I'm also curious to know what sort of what you all have seen in terms of this more, in this recent era, since this emergence of these very visible protests, right, 2 years ago. If you've noticed changes in terms of whether it's artivism or cultural practices, messaging in urban public spaces, and also in terms of navigating that tension, right, of the ambiguous nature. I'm thinking back again to Dr. Boston's presentation. That sort of tension between opposition and appropriation. This is also just for.
Sure, I mean, gosh. Did I hear somebody else or was it just? Okay, yeah, I hate to say it, but everything is for sale, you know, like, you know, I think that doesn't mean you stop creating the art, but I think that we have to engage, you know, as viewers, as consumers, or as creators, we just got to engage critically. And we've got to know that, you know, the art can be political, but it also, if you want to make change, you've also got to tether it to some more explicit politics, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. So I also deal with hip hop in my work and thinking about how, like, I look at the Barclays Center Arena is a big, you know, symbol of what's going on, because, you know, bringing in Jay-Z and hip hop, it kind of puts this once oppositional Black art form as a face of a predatory capitalist project, right? And so, you know, it's tough, right? And the use of these oppositional art forms as these billboards, it doesn't mean that the art form is no longer useful, right? It's just, unfortunately, some aspects are easily co-opted. And so I think that this is a tension that we're going to explore in these times. We're in a time when, as Brandy Thompson Summers, she's an awesome geographer out of Berkeley, and she writes, you know, it's a lot of it is about, in my work at least, about how diversity and multiculturalism are being transformed from a social justice mandate to a lifestyle amenity, right? Does that mean that we don't talk about diversity? Does it mean that we don't talk about multiculturalism? No, but we have to be critical and honest about the ways that these things manifest, and we have to keep pushing to stay true to the original intent, if that's what we want to do. So a lot of it is just about continued vigilance and critical engagement, and continuing to push against just this absorption into these extractive industries and institutions.
Yeah, looks like, Ricardo.
Yeah.
Yo quería incorporar.
I just wanted to incorporate one more element here that all of the presentations had it. It's the use of photography in a digital society like we have today, where social networks are everywhere. The work in and of itself isn't so important. What is important is what photography allows to achieve on the long term. And in a lot of cases, it happens in Barcelona, for example, where we have these free walls. The work itself might just last a couple hours, but here comes another work on top of it. But it's important that all of these actions that are produced during the protest, they're being captured with the tools that capture those images. It's so we use these images in the place where we are, and it transcends the local frontiers. It can be more global, more international, in fact. Thank you.
maybe I cannot, well, I'm not the right person to speak about the Black Lives Matter in the US. I'm not really so much in, well, I know I'm informed, but I'm not really working in this issue, but maybe I can bring also some thoughts from Europe and how the race opposition and racism has been a base for the far right wing that is really rising in Europe in several countries. Also in Portugal, we have now a group of fascist deputies. So we have 12 people in the parliament who are well, expressly racist and misogynist and all that. So we have been seeing some also inscriptions in public space insulting particular or Black representatives in the parliament or gypsies, because also the racism against the gypsy community is really, really strong in Portugal and in other countries. So it has been the expression in public space has been used and is really centered in race right now and as a form, a tool of aggression. This is something I think it became exacerbated also during the pandemic. And we should also look at that, of course. It's really the center of discussion. Even in universities, we had descriptions like Black people go out in one of the main universities in Lisbon. And this will be conflict also in all the university, etc. So there is a big discussion, and the most impressive thing is how these discourses are becoming really expressed and assumed. Maybe people would think those kind of things before, but they were not assuming them. And so this is really becoming really scary in terms of conflict and violence and possible violence.
Yeah, thank you all for these great answers. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so thank you for responding to my questions. I don't know if Caitlin or the audience have other questions.
Yeah, I'd love to open it up to the audience. So for those of us here, welcome to raise your hand. And for folks on Zoom, if you can either raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Either way.
I have a question that's leaning more toward policy and art making. And my question is, how would you suggest artists get into the habit of not just creating work that's visually beautiful or aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but more so educational and or based on research and based on finding a solution, right, to some of these like social ills.
And I'm just going to repeat the question so that I can pick this up. So the question was, how do our panelists suggest artists create work that's not just visually pleasing, but also educational and based on research and finding some sort of shared solution? You don't want to take that one up?
Yeah.
I'm just going to plug it over there.
Yeah. Maybe I can just start and tell about, because I've been also working with the arts education, arts and cultural education, and this is a big discussion. Should you invest more on the quality, the artistic quality, the aesthetic quality of the work you develop with several communities? Or it's more important that you promote learning through artistic tools. And I think there is a consensus right now among several, at least in Europe, among professionals, that it's more important that you promote collective learning and not just being so centered in the artistic quality. Of course, quality is important, but the collective process and promoting bonds is through arts is the most important thing when you promote artistic education, basic and cultural education. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think artists are doing a beautiful job. I think sometimes research can bog it down or slow the creative process, you know? But I think, you know, some of what we're doing right now, right, which is creatives and scholars linking up and having these conversations that might inspire some stuff. You got activist groups on the ground or in the grassroots working and organizing every day that will be happy to, you know, collaborate in some way. You know, one of my slides showed a mural by a local group in Los Angeles that, you know, gets youth together and creates this, you know, these pieces. So there is work. So I guess there's a question about artists doing research informed art and community informed art, which is not always the same, but it can be. Right, but I think the best art, well, some of the best and most vibrant art, I think, is born out of collaboration, right? So I think it would be really dope to have even like a series of like artists and researchers and not just like traditional organizers, but everyday people like collaborating and seeing what can come out of this. So I think there's some pretty practical steps that, you know, could yield maybe some of the actions that you're describing. But I think it's, you know, I think it's possible. I think there are lots of people ready and willing around the world to have these kind of fruitful projects, for sure.
Ricardo, do you want to respond to that or?
Yes, I agree with what they are mentioning. I believe that the main point is the objectives that are proposed when
Eso es un punto muy
you
importante.
are creating a piece. That's a very important point, especially when you're working with communities. Thinking in some experiences in Latin America, I imagine quickly some galleries, for example, in Chile, where they're trying to expose, giving visibility to communities that are invisible in the public sector, where their professional artists are there present, but the community also has a protagonist as well. It's not only give visibility to the project, but give visibility to the community. And in addition to that, all the things that are done are good. So thinking, for example, in tourism, but also citizenship that is common in visit a community or a neighborhood that usually they wouldn't do because that community or that neighborhood, it has that name as a dangerous place. So using the excuse of the urban art, there is starting to be build the idea that we have about that community. But above all, it needs to have to be, what are the objectives behind it? It's not the same to work with older adults or children or professionals. It moves, the expectations are moved, and it may not have to do with aesthetic, but have to do with other things that are about the process. Thank you.
I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, so legislators and public policy makers and municipalities, they're put in a position where they generally restrict the strict art through permitting or what have you. So public art installations are like anything but, because really it's the state granting permission to put the art into that space, and they're restricting what can be placed into that space. What is what do you guys see as the way to permit, from a policymaker's perspective, how do you allow residents to control the public art that's put in their space and put their own public art into their spaces in a way that's dynamic? It doesn't permit things like racist imagery or that kind of thing.
So I'm just going to repeat the question for the interpreter. So the question was, from a legislator's perspective, who often control art permitting, because often the state grants permission. What is the way to design a model of permitting that allows residents to control public art in their spaces in a dynamic way, but at the same time, doesn't allow for racist imagery.
Yeah, well, I can take that. There is a discussion in my city in Porto because of the cleaning services. There is a cleaning service and they decide to clean some pieces and they decide that the other pieces are beautiful, so they don't clean it. And so it's completely, the workers decide what to clean and what should not be clean. And so the writers, of course, they want to be involved. I think this is a way to involve not only the people from those cultures, but also people working in the research and that have produced knowledge on that. Well, PhD students, you could do social workers that work with the communities. So I have a team to really follow this work, and this will allow to preserve some pieces that are really important also for the communities, because I've done also work in Porto, interviewing people that pass in the street and asking people about particular pieces. And some of them are really important for the community. They identify with that piece of graffiti and they want that piece to continue. So producing this kind of knowledge of what is symbolically important for the people in the city, including the protagonists of these cultures, the researchers, students, I think it would be a good way. Lisbon had a department and has a department, the Urban Art Gallery, involving different actors. Now it's not so active, but in the past it was a good example. I think it's an inspiring example for other cities. Unfortunately, I think we are far away from that in several cities in the world, but we must continue and try to implement that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great. I think that something similar is done, but in a different medium. So I'm thinking of community gardens that are in different cities, right? This is, again, this allocation of public space where a community is trusted, to decide its particular priorities in that space. So of course, that would go against some of the impulses toward privatization that are filling these cities, right? The conversion of public or vacant spaces to privately owned spaces rather than, turning these over to the public. And so there'd also need to be, a sort of prioritization and a recognition at the highest levels of city government that public space matters and communal space is necessary. But I think it's being done on some level. I think the community garden situation is a good example of how that can be done and allowing the neighborhoods to, really decide what life-giving aesthetic or message they want to give it. And that also builds on Ricardo's earlier comments about, communities that have gotten together to create these gorgeous murals to write against some of the dominant narratives about, what their community is like and, all the problems that are there. So it's certainly possible.
Ricardo, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I am in agreement with what you are proposing. I was thinking quickly about an example about in the city of Lima. A festival that is called Feteca is a festival of theater in open streets, and that is one of the most vulnerable cities in Lima. In that, a component of the perception of identity is in addition to the mural. For example, there are different cultural activities, and one of them is to do a mural, but through the mural, you can see the multiculturalism and other elements that constitute what it has to do with the community. I think also that has a lot to do with this, right? What place you give public space to continue to call it art in all types of ways. I also agree with the public administration that in general, the public administration is contradictory sometimes. For example, you can promote actions that are together with preserving that art or to facilitate public art, but sometimes it tries to control it and chase it. So we have to see what is it that the administration wants, what type of public space it wants, to see if we can continue different initiatives of art in that public space. Thank you.
We probably have time for one more question. Yep.
Yeah, I just want to circle back to, sort of this, there was some point, some parts of the discussion brought up, like, methodology, methods. And I'm interested as researchers, right now, in my studies, there's a lot of emphasis put on quantitative methods and data analytics and like evidence-based policy. And a lot of the times that, it's privileging particular kinds of evidence. But what I think has been great about these talks is it's showing sort of the explanatory power of these art pieces and the work of artists. And my question is, for people who are going into research, how can they incorporate art or as in their methods, or how can they think about art as a form of evidence? And then maybe that question would be a little too broad, just bringing it down to like your experiences. How have you tackled the study of art in what I would consider to classify your work as scientific might be really reductionist. I do think as the researchers and academics, there's like kind of there's a scientific edge to that, and I'm wondering how in your work, how has art maybe expanded your view of the things you're studying?
I'm just going to repeat it for the interpreters. Thank you. It's a great question. So the question is, the context for the question is, our questioner asks about how the particular presenters think about art as a form of evidence that has explanatory power that might go beyond quantitative, data-based analytics that privilege a certain kind of knowing. So I think there's a general question about how do you use art as evidence, and then like a more particular question about how you as researchers tackle the study of art as you manage creating like a scientific edge for your work, and how has art expanded your view of things? It's a big one.
Thank you for cleaning it up.
It was a great question. I mean, I can start from my particular perspective. I study African American history and culture. And so just at the outset, I have to acknowledge that Black people have been shut out of traditional halls of power for the majority of their time in this country, right? So if we only look at traditional politics, right? And traditional ways of voicing opinions, et cetera, even traditional news media, right? We miss so much that's critical, right? So I automatically am pushed out of those traditional measures in some kinds of ways of hearing what people have to say and, their opinions, et cetera. And I have to look at other ways that people make their voices heard, right? And so that's one of the reasons that arts is so important to me. But again, in terms of aesthetics, I mean, and in terms of art, I mean, I can do the quantitative, like don't play, like I can show you, I can do all the demographic changes and the census stuff, and I can read the policy. But I think, we're in a stage of gentrification where it's so much more than just rehabbing a home, right? It's also about, increasingly international flows of capital. It's about building arenas. It's about the cultural sphere, right? And so again, to understand what's new about what's happening and why it's happening and the different areas that these changes are affecting, you've got to engage the cultural sphere. And then of course, again, speaking specifically about gentrification, the idea of artists as first wave gentrifiers also requires us to take them and their products seriously. So just a couple of answers to your question.
Yeah, maybe I can add that, starting also with photography, and also I was mentioning that in social sciences, and particularly in sociology, photography as a way of collecting data has been defended by our Becker and for some time now. And there is a consensus that image has information that the words don't have. So we cannot just know the world by the words that people say or write, and not surely just looking at the official documents, because we miss a lot, particularly the experiences and the representations and discourses of the privileged people, several points of view, but also look at the images of society is really crucial to really know social reality. So I think photography and video can be powerful tools to know the different perspectives. And as Amanda was saying, of course, we can do the quantitative, but it's not just a question of how many people, how many contacts, how many times you go to the, it's to understand how people view in a more complex way their lives and the social facts, etc. So, and more when we work with communities, I think qualitative work is so precious, to really take time in these moments. That time is, it's like time is money, and you need to write your article very fast, and you need to do it very fast, collect data. It's very important to go and spend time with people. If you really get to know their views and the way they experience life, you need to stay there, and a lot of time stay there without collecting data for your research. Just staying there and let the people conduct you in their lives. It's very important to have an deep knowledge of reality. So that's why I use a lot ethnography. Participant observation is so important to really get into people's lives and understand more of their needs and problems. And that's not possible to grasp with quantitative techniques and methodologies.
Ricardo, do you want to close us out? Do you want to conclude? Ricardo, do you want to add to this?
Sí,
Yes. In methodologically terms, it's very interesting all the process that one has to do when you're doing projects like this. And other points you have to think in using photography, what Ligia was mentioning, is just the work or the context of the work. It's not the same, it changes. It turns so you can learn and understand the city. You understand the city, looking at art in the public space or urban art. You can understand it based on where this work is placed. Sometimes we say that the city is like a huge canvas, but when we start analyzing where they are and where in the city, literally, but not only literally, but also where are they placed? We also understand what is happening. For example, centers and peripheral areas in terms of communities, neighborhoods, etc. In my case, photography has served a lot. Is very linked to the inaugural Congress when it has to do with mapping. To map the city based on photography so you can understand the territory that we're working on. Another important point is that when we observe something, it's not only observe, it's just look. It's to understand or try to understand, obviously, but what is it that is happening? I think that is a very interesting point, and when you add that to the interviews, and that's when things get complex, gets complex, the complexity of it, because when you start having to have a limit, because since it's dynamic, there's always going to be new work, and so the observation will be constant. That's our problem of a challenge of our investigation. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our presenters and our interpreters, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks very much, Georgina and Joseph, and we'll see at least one of you tomorrow. Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye, Ricardo.
Ricardo is.
Bye.
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 Stop recording.
Dr. Bowski.